They told her marriage was her only salvation. They lied. At 19, Eleanor Ashford stood trembling at the altar in her delicate ivory lace gown, tears streaming down her face, sold like a piece of fine china to settle her father's mountain of debts. Beside her loomed the Duke of Blackmore, Victor Hawthorne, a man of 42, battle-scarred and terrifying, dressed in deep navy velvet that seemed to swallow the candlelight. They called him the Iron Duke, cold, merciless, a man whose brides, it was whispered, never left Blackmore Hall alive or happy. Everyone knew what happened to girls given to such a man. Everyone pitied her. But here's what they didn't know. On their wedding night, the most feared duke in the realm would give his young bride a gift so shocking, so generous, it would change her life forever and set her on a path to rewrite every cruel rule that had tried to destroy her. Stay with me until the end, dear one. You won't believe how this story turns. Now, let's begin. The old cathedral smelled of cold stone, melting wax, and fading roses. Golden candlelight flickered across the high arches and stained glass windows, but it could not warm the chill that had settled deep in Eleanor's bones. Her hands shook beneath the delicate lace gloves as she clutched her bouquet of white roses. The ivory gown that had once looked so innocent now felt like a funeral shroud. "Stop that crying, child," her aunt, Mrs. Margaret Langford, whispered sharply, fingers digging into Eleanor's arm. "You'll ruin everything." Eleanor wanted to laugh through her tears. Ruin everything? Her entire life had already been sold away. Then the heavy doors creaked open. He arrived like a storm made flesh. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver threading his dark hair, his deep navy velvet coat catching the candlelight like midnight silk. The scars on his face told stories of wars and pain no gentlewoman should ever know. When his piercing gray eyes met hers, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was the man they had given her to. This was the Iron Duke. And in that terrifying moment, standing beside him before God and witnesses, Eleanor Ashford had no idea that the most dangerous man in the North was about to hand her the one thing she had never dared to dream of: freedom. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as they passed, beneath the ancient stone archway, and Eleanor Ashford pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her heart still racing from the long, silent journey. Golden lantern light spilled across the towering walls of Blackmore Hall, turning the dark stone into something almost alive, stern and watchful, yet strangely beautiful in the misty night. This was no welcoming home. It was a fortress, brooding against the wild moors, exactly as the rumors had warned. The Duke had barely spoken during the ride. He sat across from her in his deep navy velvet coat, his scarred face half hidden in shadow, offering only brief instructions to the driver. When the carriage finally stopped, he stepped down first and offered her his hand. His grip was firm, surprisingly warm, but he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. "Mrs. Graves will see to your comfort," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel. "I have matters to attend to," and just like that he was gone, disappearing into the vast halls like a ghost in his own home. A tall, gray-haired woman with kind but watchful eyes stepped forward, holding a lantern that bathed them both in soft golden light. "Welcome to Blackmore Hall, my lady. I am Mrs. Eleanor Graves, the housekeeper. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms." Nell followed her through wide corridors lined with heavy tapestries and flickering sconces. The air smelled of polished wood, old stone, and a faint trace of rosemary. Everything felt solid and enduring, built to withstand centuries of harsh northern winters. Her ivory wedding gown whispered against the flagstones, the delicate lace now looking impossibly fragile in this masculine world of iron and shadow. They climbed a broad staircase and turned into the east wing. Mrs. Graves stopped before a heavy oak door, produced a key from the ring at her waist, and opened it with a soft click. The moment Nell stepped inside, her breath caught. The sitting room glowed under the warm light of several lamps. Ivory silk draperies framed the tall windows, and delicate gold accents shimmered on the furniture and wall moldings. A fire crackled invitingly in the hearth, casting dancing golden patterns across thick rugs in cream and soft blue. Books lined one wall, real books, not merely decorative, and a writing desk stood ready with fresh paper and ink. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a bedroom with a large, canopied bed piled high with quilts, and beyond that, a private bathing chamber with gleaming brass fixtures. It was beautiful, feminine, hers. Mrs. Graves moved quietly to the fireplace, adjusting a log with practiced ease. "His Grace had these rooms prepared especially for you, my lady. The colors were chosen to suit a young bride," he said. Nell turned, stunned. "He chose this?" "Yes, ma'am. And these, Mrs. Graves reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small silver ring holding 2 keys. "Are yours and yours alone. One for the outer door, one for the bedroom. The Duke has no copies. He was most insistent on that point." Nell stared at the keys resting in her palm. They felt heavier than they should have, cool and solid. Freedom wrapped in iron. Tears pricked her eyes again, the same tears she had shed at the altar only hours earlier. "He said you are not to be disturbed unless you wish it," Mrs. Graves continued gently. "Meals can be brought here or taken in the dining hall. The library and grounds are open to you. You are not a prisoner here, my lady. Not in these rooms." For the first time since her father's death, something tight and painful in Nell's chest began to loosen. She closed her fingers around the keys, feeling their edges press into her skin. "Thank you, Mrs. Graves," she whispered. The housekeeper gave her a small, understanding smile. "You've had a long and trying day. I'll have a tray sent up shortly. Rest, my lady. Blackmore Hall can be a cold place, but these rooms, these are yours." When the door clicked shut behind her, Nell stood alone in the golden lamplight, still clutching the keys. Outside, the moors stretched dark and endless. Inside, the fire burned warmly and the ivory and gold rooms waited patiently, like a promise she had never expected to receive. She sank onto the edge of the sofa, the weight of the day crashing over her, sold to the Iron Duke, married to a stranger, and yet given a sanctuary no one had ever offered her before. For the first time in months, Eleanor Ashford allowed herself a single, trembling breath of hope. The storm struck Blackmore Hall with the fury of something long denied. Wind howled across the moors like a living thing, slamming against the ancient stone walls and rattling the windows in their frames. Rain lashed the glass in violent sheets. Nell lay in her large canopied bed, wide awake, listening to the thunder roll overhead. Sleep had refused to come. Every creak of the old house made her heart jump. Then came the crash. It sounded like breaking glass somewhere above her, sharp and sudden. She sat up, pulling on her robe and lighting a candle with trembling fingers. The golden flame flickered wildly as she stepped into the corridor. Curiosity, and perhaps a touch of fear, drew her toward the narrow staircase leading to the upper floors. The sound had come from the north tower. She climbed higher, her ivory robe trailing behind her until she reached a half-open door. Inside, chaos reigned. Rain poured through a shattered window, soaking papers and old trunks scattered across the floor. In the center of it all stood the Duke. Victor Hawthorne was wrestling a heavy board across the broken pane, his deep navy coat discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms marked by old scars. Candlelight from a single lantern cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the silver in his hair and the deep lines of strain. "What are you doing?" Nell called over the roar of the wind. "Get out," he growled without turning. "It's not safe." She ignored him, setting her candle down and grabbing the other end of the board. "Neither is doing this alone." For a moment he stared at her, surprise flickering in his gray eyes. Then, with a curt nod, they worked together. The wind fought them viciously, but between them they managed to secure the window with several boards. When the last nail was driven, the storm's roar dulled to a muffled howl. They stood panting in the sudden quiet, soaked and breathless. Nell looked around the room properly now, Children's toys, yellowed letters, a small faded dress carefully folded in an open trunk. This was no ordinary storage room. "This was hers," she said softly, picking up a damp journal. "Your sister's." Victor stiffened. "You should go back to your rooms. I'm not leaving you here like this." She opened the journal to a random page, reading aloud in a gentle voice. "Today, Victor taught me to ride. I fell 3 times, but he laughed in the kindest way." His jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, the only sound the rain beating against the boarded window. Then, in a voice rough with pain he had clearly buried for years, he spoke. "Elaine. She was 3 years younger than me. Kind, bright, everything I wasn't." He stared at the small dress in the trunk. "I left for the wars when I was 19. When I returned, she had been married off to a monster. By the time I learned what he was doing to her, it was too late. He killed her, made it look like an accident, and I couldn't save her." The raw grief in his voice pierced Nell's heart. She stepped closer, the candlelight painting soft gold across both their faces. "You were trying to save me the same way," she whispered. "That's why you paid the debts, why you gave me the keys." He looked at her then, really looked, his gray eyes haunted. "I couldn't save her. But I thought, perhaps I could stop the same fate from claiming you." Tears filled Nell's eyes. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "You did more than that, Victor. You gave me a choice no one else ever offered. That matters." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the candlelit room, something fragile shifted between them. The Iron Duke, fearsome and solitary, stood before her not as a monster, but as a man carrying unbearable sorrow. He didn't pull away from her touch. For the first time since arriving at Blackmore Hall, Eleanor Ashford felt she wasn't alone in the darkness. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm that still felt like walking on fragile ice. Nell spent her mornings in the library and her afternoons exploring the edges of the estate, but something restless had taken root inside her. She was tired of waiting in her beautiful rooms, tired of wondering what kind of man she had truly married. On the 3rd morning, she found Mrs. Graves in the courtyard. "I want to learn to ride," Nell announced. "Properly." The housekeeper looked surprised, but nodded. "Thomas will saddle Meadow for you, my lady. She's gentle." By midday, Nell was seated atop a sturdy grey mare, her ivory riding habit fluttering in the moor wind. Thomas, the head stable hand, gave patient instructions while she gripped the reins with white knuckles. The first few circles around the yard were terrifying. By the 4th, something like exhilaration began to bloom in her chest. She rode out that afternoon with only a groom trailing at a respectful distance. The moors stretched endlessly before her, rolling hills of purple heather and wind-swept grass beneath a steel-gray sky. For the first time since her wedding, Nell felt free, until she heard raised voices ahead. She urged Meadow over a low rise and saw them, a group of riders clustered near an old stone boundary wall. Victor sat tall on his massive black stallion, his deep navy coat stark against the landscape. Facing him was a thin, sharp-faced man in forest green. Lord Reginald Whitby, she guessed from the earlier whispers she had overheard. "You've moved the markstones again," Victor said, his voice cold enough to cut glass. "My tenants have lost weeks of grazing." "Lies," Whitby spat. "Your people are thieves." Tension crackled in the air. Hands hovered near pistols. Nell's stomach tightened. She knew that look in men's eyes, the moment before violence broke loose. Without thinking, she nudged Meadow forward. "Gentlemen," she called out clearly. Every head turned. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief. Lord Whitby sneered. "The new Duchess graces us with her presence. How charming." Nell lifted her chin, heart hammering. "From what I understand, this dispute has dragged on for months. Shooting each other over a few yards of grass will solve nothing." She looked straight at Whitby. "Call for a neutral surveyor from the Territorial Council. Let them measure the original deeds and reset the stones properly. Both of you witness it." Done. A stunned silence fell. Victor stared at her, something fierce and unreadable in his grey eyes. Whitby opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. That is actually reasonable. See it arranged, Victor said flatly, never taking his eyes off Nell. Now leave my lands. As the other riders departed, Victor wheeled his stallion beside her. The groom wisely fell back. What in God's name were you thinking? He demanded, voice low and rough. Riding out here alone, inserting yourself into a quarrel that could have turned bloody. I was thinking that if I'm to live here, these problems are mine too, Nell replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. And I was thinking you looked ready to do something you might regret. He exhaled sharply, running a gloved hand through his hair. You could have been hurt, but I wasn't. She softened her tone. You gave me keys and freedom, Victor. Let me use them. Let me stand beside you instead of hiding in my rooms. For a long moment he simply looked at her, the wind tugging at his coat. The hard lines of his face eased just slightly. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, he muttered. Perhaps a little of both. A small smile touched her lips. Much like teaching your sister to ride, I imagine. Something warm flickered in his eyes, surprise, respect, and something deeper. He turned his horse toward home, motioning for her to ride beside him. As they cantered across the moors together, side by side under the vast northern sky, Nell felt the first true thread of partnership forming between them. The Iron Duke was no longer a stranger, and she was no longer just the frightened bride he had saved. She was becoming something more. That evening, the great hall of Blackmore glowed with the warm light of 100 candles. Golden flames danced in silver candelabras along the long oak table, casting flickering shadows across the dark stone walls. Nell had chosen a simple ivory gown with delicate lace at the sleeves, her hair swept up softly. She arrived early, nerves fluttering in her stomach like trapped birds. Victor was already there. He rose when she entered, his deep navy velvet coat draped casually over the back of his chair, revealing a crisp white shirt and embroidered waistcoat that caught the candlelight. For the first time, he looked less like the Iron Duke and more like a man, tired, watchful but present. You came, she said softly. I gave my word. His voice was low, rough. I meant to keep it this time. They sat at one end of the long table, close enough that the candlelight warmed both their faces. Servants brought the first course, rich soup, roasted pheasant, and buttered vegetables, but neither of them touched their food at first. First, the silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. Nell took a breath. During the storm, you promised me honesty. I have 3 questions. Victor's grey eyes met hers steadily. Ask. First, she said, voice trembling only slightly. Why did you avoid me for days after the border incident? He set down his spoon. The candle flames reflected in his eyes like tiny stars. Because you were right. About the walls I've built, about how I hide behind duty and reputation. You saw through me in a single afternoon, and it terrified me. I've spent 20 years making sure no one could get close enough to hurt me again. Nell's heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. Second question, she continued gently. Tell me about your sister, all of it. Victor stared into the candlelight for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were quiet and pained. Elaine was bright and kind. I failed her. Left her unprotected while I chased glory in the wars. When I returned, she was married to a cruel man who beat her in secret. I tried to do everything properly. Petitions, the council, the law. While I followed the rules, he killed her, made it look like a fall down the stairs, and I couldn't save her. Tears slipped down Nell's cheeks. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. You're not her, he said fiercely. And I'm not that helpless boy anymore. But when I heard about your father's debts, about the men circling you like wolves, I couldn't stand by again. The third question hovered between them, but Nell found she didn't need to ask it. The answer was already there in the way he held her hand, in the golden candlelight softening the hard lines of his scarred face. "I'm not going anywhere, Victor," she whispered. "Not unless you ask me to." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I don't want you to go." For the first time, the vast hall didn't feel empty. It felt warm, alive. The Iron Duke, in his shirt-sleeves with his navy coat abandoned on the chair, looked at her not as a duty or a redemption project, but as a woman he was beginning to truly see. They talked long into the night, about the estate, about books they both loved, about the fears they had carried alone for so long. When Mrs. Graves finally cleared the dishes, neither of them wanted the evening to end. Victor walked her to the door of her apartments. At the threshold, he paused, his hand still holding hers. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying through the storm, for riding out onto the moors, for sitting here with me tonight." Nell looked up at him, the golden candlelight from the hall painting soft warmth across his face. "We're in this together now. No more hiding." A small, genuine smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It transformed him. "No more hiding," he agreed. As she closed the door behind her, Nell leaned against the wood, heart full. The keys still hung at her waist, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to use them to lock the world out. She only wanted to let someone in. The peace shattered 3 nights later. Nell was brushing out her hair in her ivory and gold sitting room when the alarm bells began to ring, sharp, urgent, echoing through the stone corridors. She rushed to the window. Torchlight flickered wildly in the courtyard below. Men were shouting. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, growing louder. Mrs. Graves appeared at her door, face pale. "Armed riders, my lady. 8 or 10 of them. The men who wanted you before the wedding. They've come for you." Nell's stomach twisted with fear, but something stronger rose beneath it. She grabbed a dark shawl and hurried downstairs. The main hall was already filling with the household staff. Thomas with rifles, the grooms carrying pitchforks and old swords, even young Annie clutching a kitchen knife with trembling hands. Victor stood at the center like a force of nature, deep navy coat flung over his shoulders, loading a pistol with swift, practiced movements. His face was carved from granite, eyes cold as the moors. "Take her to the cellar," he ordered Mrs. Graves without looking up. "No." Nell stepped forward, voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I will not hide while they come for me." Victor's head snapped up. "This is not a request, Eleanor, and I am not asking." She met his gaze, the golden lantern light catching the determination in her eyes. "These men are here because of me. I stand with you." For a heartbeat, conflict warred across his scarred face. Then something shifted, pride, fear, and fierce protectiveness all at once. He handed her a pistol, his fingers brushing hers. "1 shot," he said roughly. "Brace yourself. Aim for the center of the chest, if you must, and stay behind me." The hoofbeats grew deafening. Torches blazed beyond the massive iron gates. A voice rang out, crude and mocking. The shipping magnate who had once spoken so vilely to her aunt. "Send out the girl, Hawthorne. She was promised to us before you stole her." Victor moved to the speaking grill in the heavy door. "You have no claim here. Turn around and leave, or you will not leave at all." Nell stepped up beside him, pistol heavy in her hands, her white nightgown and shawl a stark contrast against the dark stone. The wind whipped her hair. Rain began to fall in icy sheets, soaking the ivory fabric until it clung to her like a second skin. The riders laughed. One raised a pistol toward the gate. That was when Nell spoke, her voice ringing clear and strong through the grill. "I am no man's property," she cried. "I chose my husband. I chose this house. If you come any closer, I will shoot you myself and sleep soundly afterward." A stunned silence fell. Then chaos. The riders surged forward. Victor barked orders. Thomas and the men fired from the gatehouse. The night exploded with gunfire and shouts. Victor pulled Nell behind a stone pillar as bullets chipped the wall above them. "Stay down," he growled. But she refused. When one rider tried to scale the gate, Nell raised her pistol with both hands and fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the man fell back with a cry. Victor looked at her with raw, startled admiration. Together they fought, side by side in the pouring rain. Golden lantern light reflected off wet stone and the deep navy of Victor's coat. The household stood with them, a small but determined army. Mrs. Graves directed the younger staff with calm authority while Annie passed powder and shot. The battle was short but brutal. The attackers, realizing they faced not a frightened girl but a united household willing to bleed for their Duchess, began to falter. One by one they retreated into the stormy darkness, curses fading on the wind. When the last rider disappeared, silence fell, broken only by the rain and heavy breathing. Victor turned to Nell. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with the blood from a shallow cut on his cheek. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. Her soaked ivory nightgown pressed against his deep navy coat. "You magnificent, impossible woman," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "You could have been killed. So could you," she answered, clinging to him. "But we stood together. That's what matters." In the golden glow of the lanterns, surrounded by their loyal household, the Iron Duke held his bride as if she were the most precious thing in his world. The siege was over, and something unbreakable had been forged between them in the rain and fire. The morning after the siege dawned gray and quiet, as if the Moors themselves needed time to recover. Nell woke to golden sunlight spilling across her ivory bed covers, her body aching from the night's chaos. A faint bruise marked her shoulder where the pistol had kicked back, but she felt strangely alive. Victor found her in the breakfast room. He wore his deep navy coat again, though his eyes carried the softness of someone who had barely slept. Without a word, he crossed to her and brushed a gentle kiss against her temple, the first time he had ever done so. "You should be resting," he murmured. "I rested enough." She touched the cut on his cheek. "We both survived. That's what matters." They had barely finished breakfast when Garrett, the steward, entered with a heavy sealed letter. His face was grim. "A summons from the Territorial Council, Your Grace. They're calling a full assembly in 3 weeks. The main topic," he hesitated, "unconventional marriages. They mean to introduce regulations, age restrictions, mandatory approvals, reviews of consent. Your marriage is at the center of it." Victor's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Morse and his faction. They didn't like losing the complaint after the riders attacked. This is their revenge. Nell felt ice slide down her spine. "They want to declare our marriage invalid? They want to make sure nothing like it ever happens again," Victor said darkly. "They'll paint me as a predator and you as a helpless child sold for debts." For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. Then Nell lifted her chin. "Then we fight them. Together." The next days became a whirlwind of preparation. They worked side by side in the library, golden lamplight warming the dark wood as they reviewed documents, wrote statements, and practiced arguments. Victor's deep navy coat often lay draped over a chair while he paced in his shirt sleeves. Nell, dressed in soft ivory, sat at the desk making careful notes in her elegant hand. One afternoon, a messenger arrived bearing a letter from Lord Reginald Whitby. Victor read it aloud, disbelief in his voice. "Though we have had our differences, I witnessed your wife's courage and clear thinking on the moors. What the council proposes is unjust. You will have my public support at the assembly and my vote. Appearances matter less than results." "Whitby," Nell smiled faintly. "Even our enemies can become allies." Victor looked at her with open wonder. "Because of you, you changed his mind that day. As the days passed, their closeness grew in small precious ways. They took evening walks along the battlements when the weather allowed, her arm tucked through his. Sometimes they simply sat together in the library, reading in comfortable silence while the fire crackled. One night, Victor pulled her onto the settee beside him, his arm around her shoulders as the golden firelight played across her face. "I never expected this," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was only saving you. I didn't know you would end up saving me." Nell turned to him, her fingers tracing the silver at his temple. "We're saving each other." He leaned down and kissed her then, slow, tentative, and full of wonder. When they drew apart, both breathless, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens at the assembly," he whispered, "I choose you, Eleanor, not because of duty or guilt, because you are the best thing that has ever walked into my life." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she kissed him again, the taste of hope on their lips. Outside, the moors stretched cold and vast, but inside Blackmore Hall, something warm and unbreakable was being built. One golden-lit evening, one shared secret, one act of courage at a time. The assembly loomed like a storm on the horizon. But for the first time, Nell was not afraid. She was ready. The Territorial Council Hall was a grand, forbidding chamber filled with the rustle of silk and the weight of 200 watchful eyes. Golden sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, catching on polished wood and brass, but the air felt thick with judgment. Nell sat beside Victor at the respondents' table, her elegant ivory gown shimmering softly against the dark oak. Victor, imposing in his deep navy velvet coat with silver threading at the temples, radiated quiet strength, though his hand found hers beneath the table and held on tightly. Chairman Morse banged his gavel, his voice dripping with false concern. "We are here to discuss the dangers of unconventional marriages, those marked by vast age differences, financial coercion, and questionable consent. The case of Duke Victor Hawthorne and Miss Eleanor Ashford has brought these issues to light." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed pity, others open disdain. Nell's heart pounded, but when Victor squeezed her hand, she rose to her feet. "With respect, Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hall, "you speak of me as if I am not here, as if I am still that frightened girl sold at the altar. I am not." She stepped forward, ivory skirts whispering across the floor. Every eye followed her. "I stood in that cathedral with tears on my face because I believed my life was over. My father's debts had made me currency. But the Duke paid those debts before I ever said I do. He gave me keys to my own rooms. He offered me an exit after 6 months. He asked what I wanted when no one else ever had. That is not coercion. That is honor." A few gasps sounded. Morse's face tightened. Victor stood beside her, tall and unyielding in his deep navy coat. "My wife has more courage and more sense than most men in this room. She has managed estate accounts, resolved border disputes, and stood beside me when armed men came to take her. She is no victim. She is my partner." Lord Reginald Whitby rose from the gallery. "I fought against this man for months over grazing rights." Then his Duchess rode onto the moors and suggested a neutral surveyor in 5 minutes, something none of us had considered. "That is not the action of a helpless girl. That is competence. I stand with them." Another voice joined, Councillor Drake, and then Lady Remington, an older woman who spoke bitterly of her own arranged marriage. "For 30 years I have lived in a proper union that was nothing but misery. Do not tell me age and appearances matter more than genuine partnership." The hall erupted. Morse banged his gavel repeatedly, face flushed with anger. "This is highly irregular." "What is irregular?" Nell cut in, her voice ringing with passion, "is punishing 2 people for daring to build something real. I was sold to settle debts, yes. But I chose to stay. I choose Victor Hawthorne every single day. Not because I must, but because he sees me as an equal. If this council wishes to protect women, protect our right to choose, not chain us with new rules designed to keep us powerless." Victor's hand rested at the small of her back, steady and warm. In the golden light pouring through the windows, they stood together, ivory and deep navy, unbreakable. The vote was called. When Chairman Morse finally announced the result, his voice was tight with defeat. "The motion to regulate such marriages fails." Cheers and angry shouts exploded across the hall. Nell turned into Victor's arms as relief crashed over her. He held her close, right there before the entire assembly. his deep navy coat enveloping her ivory gown. "You were magnificent," he whispered against her hair, voice thick with emotion. "My brave, brilliant wife." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of triumph. They had not only defended their marriage, they had struck a blow for every woman who had ever been told her choices didn't matter. As they left the hall hand in hand, the Moors waited beyond the city, but Blackmore Hall no longer felt like a fortress built to keep the world out. It felt like home. The journey back to Blackmore Hall felt different. The moors, once so vast and lonely, now seemed to welcome them home under a sky painted with soft evening light. Nell sat close to Victor in the carriage, her head resting against his shoulder, his deep navy coat draped around them both like a shield. Neither spoke much. Words felt too small after the triumph of the assembly. When they finally stepped through the great doors, Mrs. Graves greeted them with quiet joy and a warm supper waiting in the smaller family dining room. Golden candlelight filled the intimate space, softening every edge. After the meal, Victor took Nell's hand and led her not to her apartments, but to the library, the room that had become their sanctuary. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing golden light across the shelves of books and the deep crimson rugs. Victor poured 2 glasses of wine, then turned to her, his gray eyes more open than she had ever seen them. "Sit with me," he said softly. They settled on the wide settee, her ivory gown pooling around her like moonlight. For a long moment they simply watched the fire, fingers intertwined. "I have something for you," Victor said at last. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the formal document they had drawn up months ago. The 6-month exit clause. The paper that had once promised her freedom. He held it between them, then slowly tore it in half. The sound was soft, final. "I don't want an exit," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Not now. Not ever. I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I love your courage on the moors, your fire in the council hall, the way you look at me like I'm not a monster. You walked into my life as a frightened bride in an ivory gown and somehow became the heart of this entire house. I choose you. Completely. Freely. For the rest of my days." Tears welled in Nell's eyes. She reached up and cupped his scarred cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "I love you too, Victor," she whispered. "I was so afraid that night in the cathedral. I thought I was walking into a cage. Instead, you gave me keys. And then you gave me something far more precious. You gave me a partner, a home, a man who sees me as his equal." Her voice trembled. "I don't want to leave. I want to stay and build a life with you. I choose you, every scarred, stubborn, wonderful part of you." Victor pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. His deep navy coat enveloped her ivory gown as he kissed her, deeply, tenderly, with all the love he had been holding back for months. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "No more clauses," he murmured. "No more distance. From tonight forward, this marriage is real in every way. You are my wife, my Duchess, my heart. And you are my husband," she replied, smiling through happy tears. "The man who turned a desperate sail into the greatest love I could ever know." They stayed wrapped in each other's arms long into the night, talking softly by the golden firelight. About the future, about children they might one day hold, about the quiet revolution they had already begun. Outside, the Moors slept under starlight, but inside Blackmore Hall, 2 lonely souls had finally found their way home. Victor carried her upstairs later, her head nestled against his shoulder, her ivory gown trailing behind them like a bridal train. When he laid her gently on the bed, in the rooms that were no longer just hers but theirs, Nell looked up at him with complete trust and joy. This was the true wedding night gift he had promised her. Not keys, but forever. 5 years had passed since that tearful day in the cathedral, yet on quiet evenings Nell still marveled at how completely her life had changed. She stood at the nursery window at Blackmore Hall, cradling their daughter, little Elaine, against her shoulder. The child had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Golden lamplight spilled across the room as Victor stepped up behind Nell, wrapping his strong arms around both of them. His deep navy coat was gone for once. He wore only shirt sleeves, the silver at his temples catching the light. "She's finally asleep," Nell whispered. Victor pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were magnificent today in the council chamber." Nell had been appointed a counselor the previous year, the first woman to hold such a position in the Northern Territories. Today she had successfully pushed through new tenant protections. The reforms were spreading, slowly but surely changing lives across the moors. They moved together to the library, their favorite room. A warm fire crackled in the hearth, bathing the space in rich golden light. Victor poured them each a glass of wine and pulled her down onto the settee beside him. Just as he had done on the night, he tore up their exit clause. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her hand. Being sold to a scarred, difficult old duke in a desperate bargain. Nell turned to look at him, her ivory dressing gown soft against his chest. "Never. Not for a single day." She rested her head on his shoulder, remembering it all. The early years had not been easy. There were still nights when Victor's nightmares of his sister woke him in a cold sweat. There were council battles, cruel gossip, and moments when Nell doubted her own strength. But through every storm they stood together, ivory and deep navy, courage and quiet honor. Their love had grown deep and steady, like the roots of the ancient oaks on the moor. They worked side by side managing the estate. Nell's clever mind and Victor's experience created something greater than either could have achieved alone. Tenant satisfaction soared. Border disputes were settled with words instead of weapons. And slowly other young women began to speak up, demanding choices of their own. Now, as they sat together in the golden firelight, Victor lifted her hand and kissed her wedding ring. "You gave me back my heart, Eleanor," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I was half dead when I found you, cold, empty. You brought light into this fortress and taught me how to live again. And you taught me I was never just something to be sold," she replied softly. "You gave me keys, then gave me wings. You saw me when the world saw only a debt to be paid." Outside, the moors lay peaceful under starlight. Inside, the fire warmed two people who had once been strangers bound by desperation. Victor pulled her closer. From a terrified bride in an ivory gown to the Iron Duchess who changed the North. "I am in awe of you every single day." Nell smiled, tears of quiet joy in her eyes. "And I love you more with every year, my Iron Duke, my husband, my partner, my everything." As the candles burned low and the fire settled into glowing embers, they remained wrapped in each other's arms. Two souls who had taken the cruelest beginning and turned it into the most beautiful story. The desperate sale at the altar had become a revolution of the heart, and in the golden light of Blackmore Hall, their love continued to write new chapters. Brighter, stronger, and forever theirs. 10 years after that fateful morning in the candlelit cathedral, Eleanor Hawthorne stood once more in the same grand territorial council hall, but this time not as a frightened bride, but as Councillor Hawthorne, respected and formidable in her elegant ivory silk. The chamber was filled with the same golden light that had witnessed their beginning. Victor sat in the gallery, watching her with open pride, their 9-year-old daughter Elaine beside him, swinging her legs and trying not to look bored. Nell rose to speak, her voice clear and strong. 10 years ago, I was sold to settle a debt. Today, I stand before you not as property, but as proof that even the most desperate beginning can become something beautiful. When two people choose each other freely, every single day." She looked directly at Victor. Their eyes met across the room, deep navy and ivory, scars and courage, fear that had become love. Later that evening, back at Blackmore Hall, the three of them walked the battlements as the sun set over the moors in streaks of gold and rose. Elaine ran ahead, laughing, her dark hair flying in the wind. Victor slipped his arm around Nell's waist, pulling her close. His deep navy coat brushed against her ivory shawl. "Look what you built," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "From a terrified girl in tears at the altar to this." Nell leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We built it," she corrected softly. "Together." The Iron Duke, once feared, once lonely, pressed a kiss to her temple. The scars on his face had not faded, but the coldness in his eyes had long since melted away. "I was supposed to be your cage," he quietly. "Instead, you became my freedom." "And you were meant to be my ending," Nell whispered, smiling up at him. "Instead, you became my beginning." Below them, the moors stretched vast and wild. Inside the ancient stone walls of Blackmore Hall, golden lights glowed in every window, warm, welcoming, alive. The desperate bargain made in fog and fear had become a love story that would be told for generations. A marriage born of necessity had grown into a partnership that changed their world. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking color, Duke Victor Hawthorne and his Duchess Eleanor stood together, hand in hand, heart to heart, exactly where they belonged. Forever, the end. If this story has you hooked, if you can feel that slow, gripping tension, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys unforgettable storytelling. New stories drop every day, each one more intense than the last. And before you leave, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's part of this journey. We may be wrapping up here, but the drama doesn't end. If your pulse is still racing, keep it going. The next 2 stories on your screen go even deeper, darker, bolder, impossible to ignore. Subscribe so we stay connected. Then pick one and dive in. Your next obsession is just one click away.